Hey, Leah, thanks for joining today. We set this up to talk a little bit about StateRamp and what you guys are doing. And then I teased an announcement of some new work we're going to be doing with you guys, which we're real excited about. So thanks for taking a half hour off of your lunch or near lunch to come and talk to people about what we're doing. So why don't you introduce yourself? And then in the course of doing that, why don't you just quickly give an introduction to what StateRamp is?
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me, and happy to have, a virtual lunch here anytime. My name's Leah McGrath, and I have the privilege and pleasure of serving as the executive director of StateRamp. Prior to joining StateRamp, I worked kind of in and around state and local government for about 20 years, most recently serving as deputy mayor for the city of Fishers, Indiana, where I live. I like to say it's the best place to live because, I helped make it that way. But working in and around state and local government, I found myself often in a part of initiatives that I'm sure you're familiar with, Dustin, that we like to call modernization initiatives. And that took on lots of forms. But where I really found a lot of passion was how do we bring technology faster to government? How do we serve citizens better, meeting their expectations and needs in a digital environment? How do we help our team members connect with data, but also do it all in a secure way? And that became the rub. We had a lot of aggressive discourse in my time working with different leaders, trying to figure out how to do that. How do we adopt technology, or how do we stay up with the times in our service in a way that still respected the need to be really secure, respected the role that government plays in managing the integrity of the data and security and privacy. And it was through those efforts that I became connected with the founders of StateRamp, the founding steering committee. And so that leads right into StateRamp, I think, and why it was founded was to help, I think, everyone who was in my position or is in my position now to really streamline security requirements, to be able to make those decisions faster with more confidence, but really importantly, to have transparency in the security posture of the products that are so integrated with government today. And so StateRamp is a nonprofit. We're a 501c6 membership organization. And as a nonprofit, we have members who are leaders in both the public and private sector who come together to really drive toward best practices in cybersecurity, to create and recognize standard set of requirements and controls for those best practices so that we can verify the security, not just once, but in an ongoing way to facilitate better communication and hopefully stronger cybersecurity postures for everybody.
So I'm calling this type of series a change agent chat because it's people who are doing something to make a difference and make an impact. And I'm interested in letting people hear about it. So that was a good introduction to StateRamp. I mean, maybe like go a little deeper on what status quo are you trying to affect, and like what wasn't happening before what StateRamp is trying to do, so that people can really kind of understand why this needs to be successful.
Absolutely. And I think it's sort of a culture shift for government as well as for the private sector who serves government, to recognize that we truly are in this together, right? The private sector and, government really the public sector really relies on the tools and technology of the private sector to deliver services, to power government, to maintain the infrastructures. And so we are in that, we are there. The future is now in terms of that public-private partnership that powers government. And so the change that we're trying to really institute is, how do we more effectively and more efficiently, in a standardized way, measure the cyber preparedness or cyber maturity of the products that the government's using. And so what has been the challenge, what's been
Lost your audio
for,
there.
maybe
Yeah.
provider.
We lost your audio when you started describing the challenge. So maybe come back.
Oh,
Come back.
I'll start over. Sorry about that. It used to be that in order to do business, maybe when a provider or a vendor or supplier is signing that contract with a public agency, it used to be just sign here and say that you meet these requirements, right? Self-attestation. Well, we know that's not enough when we're thinking about cybersecurity and the responsibilities that we have together. And so the challenge has been, well, what should that standard be? How do I demonstrate and prove that this vendor meets my minimum security requirements to do business, to entrust them with our government data, our citizens' information or infrastructure? And so what we saw happening was really a range of things. And that's the challenge for the private sector. You saw some who are relying still on self-attestation, some who are relying on, well, we'll just require greater cyber insurance requirements. That'll cover us. You see some who are creating their own systems for verification. So really, public sector agencies or governments who are dedicating their own staff to assessing the risk of vendors and those products. Some of them were relying on the federal program known as FedRamp, saying, well, as long as you're FedRamp authorized, we can leverage you, we can use you. So it was a myriad of things that were happening, challenges with all of the above, right? In FedRamp, in order to maintain a FedRamp authorization, you've got to have a minimum contract for business with a federal agency because it's a federal program, and the information shared is only shared in the federal government space. So if you do work outside of that, or if you're a state or a local government, you don't have access to that information. The challenge with self-attestation is you really don't know the risk. You don't know where the potential risk is coming from on that end. In the middle, we have a lot of resources being dedicated during a time that we see huge shortages in the cyber workforce, right? You can't talk to a state or a local government or a private sector company who isn't searching for cyber talent. There's a shortage out there. So in order to really do this well, we do need to come together, but it's such a perfect solution in my mind, because whenever you've got a common problem or a shared problem like states and local governments and higher ed and K through 12 have of, hey, how do I validate the cyber posture of the businesses or the products I'm using? You can have a common solution. And that's where StateRamp fills in to say, hey, rather than you dedicating your time to assessing vendor risk, you can leverage StateRamp solutions that are consistent and meet really the best practices and standards established by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And so that's the problem we're trying to solve. I think the other shift that's important to talk about is or problem that we've seen, challenge that we've seen is because of the limitations and bandwidth and budget for doing these assessments, what we've seen happen out there across the country in the public sector area is one-off requirements. So rather than treating all of the vendors, right, the same, we do one-off requirements because I know I can dedicate team to do a vendor assessment for this one. It's really important. It's really high profile, but maybe we're forgetting or not omitting because of bandwidth issues, some of the other lower profile, but potentially still very risky from a cyber perspective. So those are some of the culture shifts that we're starting to really talk about.
Well, I think StateRamp is it really is in a really interesting spot and solving a problem that otherwise probably would end up being super messy. You mentioned, well, we could use the federal process. Well, there may be a lot of people who don't have or don't intend to pursue as a primary function of their entity to pursue federal business. I mean, there's a lot of run up and infrastructure to doing business there. And then also just being able to have as a software provider, being able to know what's the target, like what am I trying to get to so that
Yes.
it's not jumping
Yes.
around all the time. And for the public sector side, we want people to respond to our solicitations. So, unless we know why we're asking for something that's out of step in the market, then we could over ask and end up messing up our RFPs. So you use a phrase that I use in other kind of instances or scenarios, but a similar phrase of, complete once and use many times, where it's, if we say this is a stance and a posture that would represent what voice of the vendor community as well, what is reasonably aggressive but attainable, then it gives people targets to build to and drive to. And without that ability to establish that common point, a lot of these solicitation events are just going to chase their
Yes.
tail. So what I like about StateRamp is I feel like you are able to reduce costs for both service providers and governments in solving a particular problem that really needs that nexus point between service providers and government. So talk about this complete once, use many as a philosophy that you guys are trying to implement.
Oh, absolutely. And this is really where I think, all the members, public and private, benefit, but I think especially about those procurement or InfoSec teams who are evaluating the solicitations. You made that comment, Dustin. It's like, we've seen solicitations that require, sometimes you're uploading hundreds of pages of Q&A or reports. Well, someone has to review all of that, which is an enormous amount of work for both the vendors who are having to supply all of that information, but also for the buying agency and their InfoSec team to have to review and somehow make sense of really sometimes apples to oranges material and information. And so what we've got in a series of just solutions, we have our progressing snapshot program, and then we have our verified statuses, which are at the highest level to say, yes, this is an authorized solution. But the idea is, because we have a centralized program management office, providers are able to report all that information into one place in order to achieve their snapshot score, or to report on the progress they're making, or to report in the continuous monitoring activities if they have a StateRamp ready or authorized certification. And so by reporting into one security team, what they're able to do is then provision access to any of their government clients. So they report once. Our PMO, the StateRamp Program Management Office, is managing, I'm going to say, compliance with those requirements. And then all of the provisioning happens by the vendor. So the provider has the ability to say, yep, I want these customers to have access to my continuous monitoring reporting, or to have access to any kind of proactive notifications that happen in the system, so that rather than them having to report out or provide things in different formats or different Q&As, right, to 50 different government clients, they're able to do that once in order to serve the many. And I think that's a huge benefit, but not just to the provider community, to our participant governments, who are able to then, it's apples to apples every time, right? It's the same set of standards, and we are raising the bar. I think when you mentioned this, like when it's sort of a moving target, it's real hard to know what I'm working toward. But when we are able to say, these are the standards, this is the best practice, this is the minimum of what we're looking for, you can raise the bar because everyone can come together toward that. And so I think that's another big benefit. But for the participating governments, they're able to receive ongoing communication, receive proactive notifications if there's something amiss. We have a continuous monitoring escalation guide. And then they're able to also, and I think this is really key, if you've got governments out there who've dedicated staff to doing the assessments, they can really shift that time from being an assessor to managing risk. But on the procurement side, this has huge upside, I think, for the procurement team, because they're able to really simply, in an upfront solicitation, you could request a StateRamp security snapshot. That's very entry level, meaning what our security snapshot basically is a, think of it like a credit score. So it's a gap analysis that comes out with a score, and it gives you the cyber maturity of a product relative to those best practices of NIST, of the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So for the most minimum critical controls, where are they? And that's an apples to apples comparison. It's going to simplify, rather than hundreds of pages, you're getting a couple of pages. And it's something that's meaningful for your InfoSec team, that allows procurement then to treat every single solicitation consistently with the same information.
Well, so let's play with that for a second. I mean, if somebody, if a procurement entity wants to include StateRamp compliance as a way to prove that somebody meets a bundle of requirements, but somebody wants to bid on something and they don't yet have a StateRamp certification, what do you do to support those guys?
So that's really where the snapshot program came into play. So what we've learned is we've been working with our participating governments and provider community. And as you know, because you've worked in this space a long time, right? There's achieving a cyber maturity is a journey. It takes some time. And so you can't just stop doing business or put all of your procurements on hold until the providers are able to achieve a certain level of certification or maturity. And so what we have is what we recommend as best practices would be to say, hey, you're working toward a StateRamp authorization. So maybe you make that a requirement for whomever the awarded contract goes to. You say, hey, we want you to become StateRamp authorized in a period of time. But upfront, anyone can have a security snapshot. So our StateRamp security snapshot program, here's how it works. And this is kind of the beauty of it, is for those scenarios, but it's really for any size business can come in. They come to StateRamp and we're able to provide a StateRamp security snapshot within 3 weeks of them kind of submitting their information. Think of it like a mini audit. They're going to hop on a call with our security team. We've got a list of questions. In order to receive points for each item of criteria, they've got to show evidence to that point or to that item. And what that does then is produce that snapshot score. So if you are a procuring agency and you'd like to include StateRamp, we're going to say, that's amazing, to be able to open this up to any vendor, regardless, or any supplier, bidder, regardless of size or maturity. Start with a snapshot. Now, if they have a StateRamp ready or StateRamp authorized, that's going to exceed, right? That's probably full. that checks a big box for you. But what the snapshot is going to give you is transparency and visibility into the cyber maturity in a really simplified, standardized way.
So, on the government side, I would imagine that you need to get buy-in from both, basically the CIO shop and the CPO shop, to make this fully actualize and realize. So where are you on the journey? Like, are you much further ahead with the CIOs and you're moving to the CPOs? Are you at the same place in both? Like, how do you get the message out to both drive the CIO as the business to say this is acceptable, and the CPO to actually, implement this so that we can take advantage of the opportunities that this kind of nexus that you've built can provide?
Yeah, great question. Typically, the conversation does start in the CIO's shop, specifically most often with the chief information security officer or chief technology officer, who really has some level of responsibility for that risk management. And they're the ones probably today that procurement after the fact is saying, oh, by the way, we just made this award. Whoever that person who raises their hand and says, hold on, I need to do a check, that's probably where the conversation starts first. And they're the ones who typically really drive forward StateRamp very early in the conversation. Usually in our first call, we're saying, hey, let's include procurement in this call, right? Like, we really need to get procurement involved in the conversation. And there are definitely other people as well who are stakeholders, but you really named the two primary, which would be in your IT shop and your procurement shop. And the reason for that is is that a lot of, these requirements do get incorporated into T's and C's of contracts, right? Solicitations up front. And one of the things with StateRamp that we have the opportunity to do is really put really understand better the security posture up front. So you could vet the people you're going to work with or that product you're going to use up front before you make a buying decision, versus right now we hear a lot, I'm sure you do too. We hear a lot from our provider members as well as our participating governments, kind of that tension that exists where procurement makes a buying decision, then the vendor is sent over to the InfoSec team who does a vetting. And sometimes that can take a long time, and we're slowing down time to actually getting to work. And so if we can push that to the front, then I think we can get to work faster. We can bring innovation to government faster and in a more secure fashion. And so we're trying to bring procurement in as early and as often as we can. But typically, and where we are now, is typically talking first with those CIOs and CISOs and their teams about the challenges and the benefits, and then bringing procurement into the conversation.
So if anyone is listening to this live, if you drop a comment into the chat, then I'm happy to ask Leah a question. If you're watching on demand, then that won't be an option for you. So I have like two more questions. One, we hadn't really discussed this, but I'm just curious from your conversation. You mentioned cybersecurity and requirements. So we've seen some really wide variety of cybersecurity requirements, and there have been some that, as a small business, would require both insurance that, frankly, is generally unobtainable because the insurance community is afraid of loss and in those kind of things. And then the process and procedure that you have to do for some of it also is a small bit out of hand for small businesses. Although we did manage to get some finally, for a project that started last year. But I guess my question is, there's kind of a connection between the requirements for security that maybe can be in place, and then the levels and types of insurance that we might require. Because if we're really afraid that something's going to break, we may ask for insurance levels that are basically not provided by the insurance community. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, what, if any, connection does the StateRamp process have to building confidence that may allow the kind of levels that we want to have for cyber insurance to be sort of market tested as to whether or not those are actually available? Do you get my question? I mean, if people can have more confidence of the requirements.
It's something we're tracking, and we're having conversations with some leaders in the cyber insurance industry as well, actually, to say, hey, if there's a StateRamp authorization or StateRamp ready, that should mean something pretty significant, when you're going to get cyber insurance. But the other thing that we're starting to hear and talk more and more with states and local governments about is exactly what you said. The insurance market's changing, and often you get that cyber insurance that won't even cover what you need. It's got all sorts of exceptions, and it's becoming harder and harder to obtain. And so really it's a question of, do you want to buy the medicine up front for if you get sick, or do you want to do the preventative care up front and reduce the odds of getting sick? Cybercrime is no different than, when I was in the city, we dealt with, talked a lot about educating on car break-ins. It's you want to secure yourself better so they move to the next person or the next company or the next car. And so, if you leave your car unlocked and you leave valuables in, you're more likely to be a victim of it. If you lock it up and you take your valuables out, you're more likely to not be a victim of it. Cybersecurity is very simplistic. It's a simplistic view of it, but if you're doing the best practices, if you're a part of StateRamp and you're continuously reporting every month, we have monthly reporting requirements. We're doing everything we can to kind of stay ahead of that curve. So if you're a part of StateRamp and you're a part of our progressing program, or you're StateRamp ready or authorized, and your government is participating in this, then you at least have the assurances that the doors are locked, the valuables are out, and every month they're reporting to you if there's something new that you need to know so you can take action if you need. I would much rather pay for the preventative care than the medicine that I might be able to take.
No, that's a great analogy. Okay. So, I posted yesterday, about, a new thing that we're going to start doing, which I'm real excited about, where we're going to a partnership in government implementation, type work. We're doing some, shadow work with you right now on a particular project. And then, being able to be an ongoing, extension of you guys in certain cases. So when we talked about that in the spring, I mean, it's important to point out to people who maybe are implementing StateRamp is that you guys have built a lot of really great self-service, type options to be able to get up and going with StateRamp. But some projects, they might be part of a bigger transformation effort, or they may require more project management than StateRamp necessarily has inside of the walls to go and execute. So, so it's a natural fit for both of us to extend in both directions, and we're real excited about supporting it. So maybe talk about like StateRamp from the perspective of implementation, both in terms of how somebody, if somebody says, I want to do this, let's start doing it tomorrow, like what kind of self-service options you've given them to be able to go and start putting this into play. And then maybe what you hope that we can prove out together on some more complex projects.
Absolutely. We really heard this loud and clear last year, from some of our members who said, this is great. How do I do it? Right. Point me in the right direction for how I can really maximize and leverage StateRamp in a way that helps me maximize the benefits from it. So we actually started this journey about a year ago, and it was the Center for Digital Government who led a working group that we had the opportunity to be a part of. And that Center for Digital Government, what they did was update a best practices guide for procurement of cloud solutions. And this is a guide that they developed first in 2014, and then they updated in 2016 and updated it most recently in March of this year, following about 9 months of working group activity. And that update is very comprehensive, but also includes StateRamp, or risk authorized management programs. So we were really excited to be a part of that because we learned so much from different procurement officials and the different stakeholders about what they were looking for. So you kind of hit the nail on the head, Dustin, is that StateRamp's a piece of that. But when you're actually thinking about what are the best practices for procuring cloud solutions, if you're looking for something more comprehensive and transformative and you want someone to come alongside, then I think, Dustin, your team's going to be amazing. I'm so excited for this relationship and partnership because that's what we've started seeing is that people are looking for not just how do I do StateRamp, but how do we do it all better? Right. Now, what we have is we do have some of our government engagement team members who are able to come alongside and really help, how to use our self-service, things. We've got templates, we've got resources, we've got sample language, kind of a how-to guide, if you will. But what we recognize is that first and foremost, you need to have somebody who owns it internally, who's that project manager, really, who's going to own the facilitation, because this type of implementation does cross multiple groups. Typically you've got to have representation from your CIO or CISO's office, and you've got to have somebody from procurement as well. And procurement is where a lot of that lift happens. And so we can help advise, our team can certainly, on how to, or what we would recommend for best practices. But and I think you've said this before, Dustin, so I'm probably going to borrow it, but butcher it, I don't know. But it said something, along the lines of, there's the go with you, or there's the let me be an extension of your team and do it for you approach. And I think that's really the difference. And what I think is going to be so great to have your team available, and you've got such a dynamic team across the country of people who've got, great expertise that I think can just continue to iterate and improve.
Yeah. You, if you have RFP templates that don't understand how to drain all the IT requirements in one place, and then be able to make sure that they're consistent with CISO standards, and then how do you change that and improve it there? So it's one thing to say we should have that standard set, but how do we apply that down into the way that the templates are built? How do we apply that all the way back when the project is being contemplated in the portfolio reviews? You know, how do we have people submit requests in a way that it informs us that something should be at one level or another level? So, you know, it's one thing to say, here's the requirements, we'll just sort of add this one sentence into our RFPs and go. But then systematically, if you say, how does this flow around so that we increase throughput and increase the applicability of it? I think that it can be part of a larger effort. And the overall discussion about how to run IT procurement so that it meets the core reason to have a CIO in the first place, which is that the sum of the individual purchases need to be, or that the whole needs to be more than the sum of the individual purchases, that there's a direction that we're going, that there's a shape to this activity. And so overall saying, what is the most effective way to drive IT procurement? It's natural that a conversation about something like this forces some examination about what is the priorities about what we put on paper and how do we have people act. It flows so quickly back towards the overall statement about how does the CIO and the IT community interact with and express themselves through the procurement activity, that those projects start to become bigger and more involved. They involve reviewing core policy documents, reviewing all of the forms and templates for consistency, and making sure that we haven't missed anything. So those projects can be done with a self-service option or a low touch option. But if it needs a little bit more work, then if you have somebody who has solved that problem before, who's trained in what this is, then, you know, the hope and the goal out of working together with you guys is that we can extend your team in a way that lets you benefit from the fact that we've done that in a lot of places. So we're very appreciative of getting to test this out with you guys and play with it and run it down and see how much work that comes from it. But we're very supportive of your mission and what StateRamp is doing, and excited to be along for the ride.
Awesome. Well, and you just touched on something too. There's the education and iteration that will happen naturally as well as this goes, because, you know, what we've continued to see is that there's hardly a service delivered anymore that's not reliant on a cloud technology in the background. So what's that underlying technology? Is there a risk there? And knowing how to look for that and what questions to ask and what your default kind of T's and C's need to be to cover you. I remember, and you may recall this too, or if I had this experience, but a contract I was a part of years ago, that we didn't have language that contemplated a transition from on-prem to cloud solution, right? Or we didn't have language in thinking about, hey, our HVAC system is now run by an app on our iPad. So thinking about when these different and how to involve these different questions in a procurement as it evolves and grows, I think is very exciting.
Great. Well, thanks, Leah, for jumping on, and thanks for sharing some continued education on what StateRamp is and how cool it is, and hopefully the kind of problems that it's solving. And like I said, for the ability to work with you guys on a current project to really come up to speed on what you guys are doing, and then being able to help support you guys at scale when other kinds of those opportunities come up. So we're excited for all of it, and I appreciate you jumping on.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thanks everybody. Have a great day. Take care.